Okay, good morning. Let's get started with Martus worksheet proposals for fiscal year 23. So for our agenda today, we're going to go through a brief overview through the slide decks, and then we'll get into Martus, going through the worksheet proposals, whether it's we're going to do the line-by-line entries as an example, loading and initializing, and then importing a budget. And then the last thing we'll cover is adding our supporting documentation to our proposals. In April, a memo went out advising everyone that the proposals are due by June 8th. So next week we have our proposals will be due. And so it's similar to Intact, Martus functions off the basis of the tribe's fiscal year. Fiscal year starting October 1st, ending September 30th. So even if you have funds that don't work on that same fiscal year, whether it's a calendar year or a completely different type of fiscal year, Martus will only function based on the tribe's fiscal year, October to September. Our annual budget proposals are prepared using the worksheets area of Martus. Important to know, because occasionally, especially at the end when people are rushing to get their budgets in, some will prepare change requests instead of using the worksheets area. We have to use the worksheets area if you submit a change request to propose your fiscal year 23 budgets. One, it's not going to get approved, and two, that means it's not going to get aggregated with the rest of the proposals presented to Budget and Finance and then to Council. So let's make sure we're using the worksheets area of Martus. For new grants, contracts, or awards, work with your program monitor to ensure that they are added before you start to work on a new proposal. If we're expecting to have new awards and those funding sources aren't created yet, when you get into Martus to prepare your budget, if those haven't been created, you won't be able to access those. You can't create them and neither can Martus. So make sure we're reaching out to our monitors to get those funding sources ready. We still have 6 days till budgets are due. So if you have new funds, we should be making those contacts to the program monitors now. Using old funding sources may delay the preparation of your budgets. So if as a fail-safe, you just say, I'll use last year's funds and use that to get my budget through, that can cause delays. If the funding sources are inactive, that means it may not sync to Intact and be available for anyone to see once the budgets are prepared. And then the last little mark on this is make sure you know which funding source belongs to which checkbook. If your program or access has multiple checkbooks, you have to make sure you're using the correct funding source there. If we have indirect cost funds and general fund funding sources, we can't mix and match those funding sources. Martus isn't going to tell you that's a problem. It will allow you to enter the budget using that. But what ends up happening is, behind the scenes, the budget will not sync to Intact. And one mistake on someone's budget prevents every single person's budget from syncing to Intact. So we have to make sure we know which funding source belongs to which checkbook before you start. If you have IHS or BIA contracts, you may need to work with Skyla or Ken Ledoux to get any accurate estimates for the awards for the upcoming fiscal year. Those proposals do get presented to Council along with all the other budgets. And if they're approved, the budget will not be made available on October 1st. Instead, the budgets happen as the CRs happen and funding becomes available, and then we'll budget from there. As you're preparing your budget, you can explore the chart of accounts in Intact, make sure we're coding our proposals correctly. A lot of times we use 75,500 other tribal program expenses because that seems to be a catch-all for all of our expenditures. Our chart of accounts has more than 200 different types of expenses to pull from. So it's very likely the type of expense you're trying to use is already a code that's available. We want to make sure our expenses are coded correctly and visible and accurate with the way that we're reporting them. And I give an example here. We're not going to use office supplies to charge vehicle fuel. You'd want to use the actual vehicle fuel, oil, antifreeze line item for that. And we'll look at it once we get into Martus, but Martus has a smart search functionality when we're trying to enter our account numbers. If we're entering our budgets line by line, we can type words to have Martus match what we're looking for. There was a separate memo that went out about the estimated payroll cost, but in this slide deck, I do have a whole page that also estimates what those are for now. So when you get the link to this, you can always refer to this or to the memo as well. So we're going to go ahead and get into Martus now. We're going to start with the line by line entry. So as we get into Martus, we're going to go to worksheets, not change requests. So we're still going to the planner menu, but we're going to be selecting worksheets and not here. The change requests are for our budget changes, our budget modifications. Worksheets is for our proposals. So when you click to go here, based on the access you have assigned, you're going to be given a list of the programs and checkbooks that you have access to. So your screen will probably look a lot different than mine. But when we first log into Martus, we're going to be given, we're logging into fiscal year 22. So the first thing we have to do when we're preparing our fiscal year 23 budget is we need to change this year to fiscal year 23. So we can click the drop down under year, change it to 23. That hasn't changed Martus yet. We can see all line by line, it still says 2022. But when I click the gray filter box, now all of those years have changed. So now I know I'm in fiscal year 23. I'm in the proper area for my budget proposal. And then depending on which checkbook you're going to work on, and Martus, they call them a worksheet, we're going to find the one we want to propose or start working on our budget, and we're going to click the edit button at the end of the line. So I'm going to filter to a certain program that we're going to use in today's examples. And we're going to hit the blue edit button so we can start working on this. When you log in, if the funding source or the checkbook has been used in fiscal year 22, we're going to have information that's going to populate. That's okay. But a few key things we want to see first. The top of our proposal should say worksheet draft FY23 budget. Another signal to us whether or not we're in the right area. Year 2023. Here's that checkbook and program. And then here we are where we know that this checkbook and program combination has been used in 2022. So it's showing to us the funding sources or funding source that has had activity in fiscal year 22, and then the line items that have had budget or expenditures in fiscal year 22. So this gives us an idea of what we're looking at, maybe what we're going to base our proposal on for fiscal year 23. If you see this and you want to cut this off the screen, you only want to see the fiscal year 23 stuff. If I scroll down, there's nothing for me to see yet. But what we can do is change this to view data. So if I use the drop down box and just hit 2023, 2022 is gone. I have just a clean screen of what we're working on, which is nothing yet. But now we're ready to start entering our budgets on a line by line basis or by manually adding them. Underneath all of that information, and then where we're going to have the save and import options, we have two drop-down boxes that are going to say account and funding source. And depending on the size of your monitor, like I zoomed in on the screen today, the add line button will be either directly below or to the right of these two drop-down boxes. If we're going to add our budget manually, we have to start selecting our account numbers and our funding source and clicking add to do that. So for this, we would need to know if we were going to budget our tribal employees, we can start typing the account number, or if we're not sure of the account number, this is the smart functionality that comes in. If I started typing employees, Martus is going to start to limit what other account numbers have that word in there. So if you're not sure of the number, but you know the name or at least part of the name, start typing the name. So we've got tribal employees. We have to pick a funding source. If we don't, Martus doesn't have the same rules as Intact, and I click to add a line, it's going to allow me to do that. That funding source column is going to be blank, and if I start budgeting here and then saving the budget, later when the proposal gets synced to Martus, the sync will fail because there won't be the required information that Intact requires. So we want to make sure we include our funding source every single time we pick an account number, and we use that funding source drop-down box. Now if we were going to budget office supplies, I'm using the same drop-down box. And at the end of that's the add line. So now we have our two account numbers that we're going to include for our proposal in fiscal year 23. If we got a little bit ahead of ourselves and we forgot to add the funding source and we were just cruising through and adding the accounts, last year this wasn't an available option, but this year it is. We can go to the end of the line, select the line item, or if there's multiple lines, you can select multiple lines. Select the option, and at the bottom of this column is an action button, and there is an option that says change dimensions. This is going to let us change the funding source or add the funding source. Last year, we would have had to delete any of the lines that didn't include the right information and then add them again, which can be frustrating and time consuming. This year, they've made that change to make it easier for us to correct any mistakes that we've made. As we're working through adding this information, if we have our proposals on what we're proposing the budget for FY23, it's a good idea as you're doing this to use the Save Worksheet button at the bottom. It's a blue Save Worksheet button. Save your work, because if you leave the screen and come back and all your work isn't saved, that would be pretty frustrating to have to deal with. Make sure we use the Save Worksheet button often. That way we know I can leave this screen, close Martus, go do other work. When I come back in, it'll be right where I left off. And so we want to make sure we know the funding source that comes to the checkbook. If we were still budgeting and adding our next line, it was going to be travel and training. And I picked this funding source, the Treasurer's General Fund funding source. Martus is not going to flag us that I've done that I've selected the wrong funding source. This one doesn't go to this program checkbook combination. So we can end up doing all of this work, not realizing that's happened. And where it happens is the next day when this budget's getting synced to Intact, I would get an error message saying that a budget failed to sync, telling me that the required program wasn't used for a funding source. If you do this, some of you out there have already gotten some emails from me asking you to make a correction. If all we have to do is change that funding source because we had a typo and we picked the wrong thing from the drop-down box, just like the area where we had it blank, all we have to do is pick the box, change the dimension, and pick the correct funding source. And now that's updated to the proper funding source. If the line item does not need to be there, you could pick that, and under action, there is a delete option. And that would get rid of that as well. So manually is probably the least complicated way of entering our budgets in Martus. So this is the way you could do this and get your job done. If you have a lot more funding sources and budget lines and don't want to spend the time entering that, we can try this next option. So I'm going to go ahead and make all the budgets visible again. So we have that 2022 still there, and then of course what we've been working on. If we didn't want to have to duplicate this, but we want to keep the same funding sources and the same account numbers that were present in FY22, we have a second option other than manually entering that. On top next to the program name is a button that says load. So if I click that, you've seen the message up here, added the 6 missing prior lines. So it's gone through and included the other items I didn't pull down from the top, as well as left the entries I already had alone. A lot faster than going down to the bottom, choosing an account, a funding source, and clicking add. So from here, we can start to make changes to our budgets. Whatever we saw or was fit based on our planning for the upcoming fiscal years, we can make those changes. And while I'm typing all the lines I just did, Martus is not saving what I've entered. So if I got an email from Martus, I have a budget mod to approve, and I left the screen to go to change requests and find that budget mod, the stuff I just added wouldn't be saved. So we always want to make sure we're still using that save worksheet button to save our progress as we go through. Okay. We can duplicate the existing budget from the top into the lines below. So we have all these lines that have activity. Some have an expense but no budget. But we see here where all the other budgets are currently at for fiscal year 22. So I'm going to delete the 23 budget and we're going to start this over. Next to load, we have a button that says Initialize Worksheet. So another option with entering our line items is first we would click Load. Here's all of those line items. And if we wanted to copy the budget, we would click Initialize Worksheet. And we can base this now on, do we want to use the actual numbers or the budget numbers? If we use the actual numbers, currently this goes through the month of April. Martus doesn't keep up with all of our expenses, so you probably don't want to use the actual numbers. But we do want to use the budget numbers. And then how much of that budget do we want to use? If we want to use 100% of that budget, that means it's going to duplicate the exact budget as what it stands today. So if we leave it at 100% and hit set values, it would have copied down from drug testing the budget that's up here for drug testing. All to the exact line. If we're proposing a change in the budget, so we hit initialize and we use all the 2022 budget numbers, and we want to see a 5% increase on our budget, all we have to do is increase this from 100% to 105. So this drug testing line, instead of having a $2,000 budget, has the $2,000 plus 5%. Now it's proposed at $2,100. And it's done the math for all of those lines. So a pretty easy way to do that. And that works with any type of change. We're going to use all those budget numbers, and we're proposing a 5% decrease. I changed that percent to 95%. And there's a 5% decrease now instead. So a pretty nifty way of doing that for however you're going to end up making your budget here. So before I get to the next way of entering our budgets, do we have any questions about manually adding lines or loading and initializing lines to pull our budgets from FY22? If you do, please use the chat box at the bottom. So we're going to delete this and start over for the next item here. So we have a question, do we get these figures from our reports? Yes, you can use your current budget to have an idea of what your proposal may be. You can, since the year's not quite over, you can use that to project where you're going to end up at the end of the fiscal year to determine how reasonable your existing budget is. Or if you're a revenue based program where you generate revenue like from solid waste sales or IT from their computer sales and other types of equipment, if your year is changing compared to previous years, you want to keep that in mind as well as you're making your proposals. And then for those with grants and contracts, that's usually already pretty laid out for us that we don't have to worry about a 5% increase or 10% or whatever. We're pretty much just proposing what our award's going to be. All right, the last area, the third way we can enter our budgets. So we have the manual entry, we have the load and initialize. The last thing is here, this yellow button that says import budget data. Okay. So one of the things I'll be sending out to everyone who signed up, and if you went to the April one, you probably got it in the April version of this training when we did that, is we can do this through an Excel spreadsheet. And so I'll make sure everyone that's signed up today, I'll include this worksheet when I send out the link to the slide deck and to the video. But we can do this by an Excel spreadsheet. There are some expectations of us when doing this. So number one, please be familiar with Excel if you're going to do this. Otherwise, use one of the two options. But in this way, it's very particular on what's going to be entered. We have a program ID column, a funding source ID, checkbook ID, account ID. Then the month we're budgeting, the total of those months. And if we needed to add notes, we can also add a note. So some specific information that goes here. But that's what I want to draw attention to is number one, this program ID column. At the top, the program, we see the number and then the name. So some of us are going to see 123 finance, 102 alcohol treatment, that kind of stuff. It's looking strictly for that 3-digit number. Not your program name, not any other information, just that 3-digit number. So here I have 198 entered instead of the whole line or the program name. It has to be the ID of the program. And that works the same way for the funding source. So we can see here with the funding source, it has that, and then it has something that repeats itself. It's looking for just the ID, not the full name of a funding source. And our funding sources are split into both an ID and a name. So for some of us, like if you have 638 funds, you might see 207 point whatever, and then an award number after that. And that whole long part on the second part's your funding source name. And so that part wouldn't be needed to be entered on the spreadsheet. We just need the ID. If you're not sure of the ID, you're going to submit your proposal or you want to import it through the spreadsheet, you can send me the spreadsheet and I can look and double check that ID for you, or reach out to your program monitor and check with them. The next column is the checkbook ID. So at the top here it says program or checkbook 2 disbursement account. It just wants the checkbook number. It doesn't need to say 3 general funds or 67 DHHS or whatever any others are named. It's just the number. The account ID. All our accounts have name or IDs and then a name. It wants just that ID, that number. We don't need to include tribal employees or office supplies or any of that. We just need the number on this spreadsheet. The next thing is the month. I already have this one queued to be October of 2022. So you're not going to have to change anything there other than what we're entering in the column. And there does have to be a total column, which should be the sum of whatever we're proposing. So when it's just the one column, they should both be the same thing. So once we have that information down, we can start to build. So I have a question. We don't need to change it to 10/1/23. No, the start of fiscal year 23 for us would be 10/1/2022. If we use any other date like 10/1/23, the 10/1/23 date would be a fiscal year 24 proposal. So once we're ready, we have this information here. This is kind of the critical information of what we need. I can drag some of this down. I don't have to keep typing it. And copy that through. And as long as we know our account numbers, you're familiar with Excel, so we're keeping up with what's happening there, we can start entering the account numbers, whatever is going to be appropriate for us. And then our amounts. We want to make sure the total columns are going to have that same information. And then our notes can be, if we don't have to have a note on this, all the other fields have to be used, but we can add notes if we wanted to. So I'm just using the notes training entries. So we have a question, what about a program where the grant starts on July 1st, 2023 of each fiscal year? If you already have the proposal here, you can include that with that, or likely you're not going to have a proposal until later in the year where that would be reviewed separately from all of the draft proposals for FY23. So once we have our information, I have as much information as I need for my budget. You can use multiple funding sources under the checkbook, but we can only do one checkbook and program at a time because we're going to be specifically working on this worksheet in Martus. So if you're like Spotted Tail Children's Home, who has funds through 638 and funds through the general fund, you're going to have two different worksheets. You're going to have one for 638 and then one for general fund if you're proposing your grant, your budgets this way. So I'm saving this. I'm ready to go. Oh, and the last thing, this tab does have to say budget. We can't have multiple tabs. There's only going to be this one tab called budget. So the file I'm sending to everyone by link, if you're going to use this, don't change this. And don't change this top row number 1, okay? So we're going to get this off screen and we're going to come back to Martus now. So I deleted the FY23 proposals we did in the other examples. So we have no budget. But here next to the import budget data, we have a choose file button. This is the one directly below our budget worksheets, not the one at the bottom of the page. So we have this here. We're going to choose file and we're going to pick something from our desktop. So I've got the file I've named. I have that ready to go and I can click import budget data. So relatively quick for what's being imported. And there we are. with that Excel spreadsheet ready to go. So as long as we're handy with Excel and pretty comfortable about getting what the expense account IDs are, checkbook ID, funding source ID, program ID, you're golden to do this. Especially if you have a lot of funding sources, this could be an easy way to do that. If you're using like the template Lynette has that helps you organize and budget by checkbook, like across columns and stuff, that's not going to work here. You do have to use this spreadsheet, but you could use both those in conjunction and copy and paste stuff into the appropriate areas. And then as we can see here on screen, next to the lines or below them, depending on how long the account number and name is, there's a little calculator button and it's blue. It's blue because there's a note. So it's telling anyone, any reader of this, that there's a note that can be read. If we've made our proposals already, a handful of us have already gotten ahead, and I think even back in April, some programs have prepared their proposals. And that was before the cost of living adjustment. So now we need to make a change to our tribal employees line. You can manually calculate that, or you can use the calculator as well and make an adjustment. I think it was 102, I think that was it. And so if I preview that, we can see what that change is going to be. And there we are. That line would have been adjusted by that, and we can make the adjustments to like our employee taxes line, that kind of stuff, where it would be appropriate. And once we're ready, we click save. As with any of these, please only use the save worksheet button. Do not use the submit worksheet button. If you hit submit, it's going to lock the worksheet. Whoever the assigned approver is going to get an email saying they need to approve. So we can see at the bottom, waiting for approval. I think Myrna is the approver for this, so she's any moment now going to be getting an email to approve this draft. But what happens because it's locked out is if Myrna takes a look at that and says, LJ, that insurance was wrong, it was supposed to be 120 or whatever change needs to be made, I can't make any changes now because this worksheet is locked. So just use the save worksheet button. Lynette or I can unlock the worksheets if you accidentally lock it and need to make a change. But why delay or wait for someone else to be able to make that for you? Just use the save worksheet button. So you can make any changes or updates that you need to as you're working on these things. All right. Great question, Ivan, because that's the next thing we're going to get into. Supporting documentation. So once we've uploaded our budgets, we're ready to go. The memo from Myrna does have some requirements of all of us with our proposals. Our revenue sources, our matching requirements, contract grant periods, 1, 3, 5-year plan, mission statement, scope of work, budget justification, job descriptions, inventory, organizational chart, future needs of the program. Basically a big magnifying glass on your program. Even revenue generating department should include historical and supporting data for their proposals. So it's a lot of stuff we have to include. And in Myrna's email, she's asking you to include that, add that to Martus instead of sending a thumb drive to Lynette. At the bottom of the worksheets page, there is a different yellow button that says upload. It's in the files section. This is where we're going to upload that detailed budget information. So if it's job descriptions and we have a new position we're going to have, we want to make sure that job description is there, job descriptions for our current staff, that kind of stuff. But under the files, and then Lynette has a comment, the spreadsheet that I emailed out is only for the program to use to help with the process, so the programs can see their entire amount of funding that they have for fiscal year 23. Once we're ready to add our attachments to this, all we have to do is click choose file, just very similar to working in Intact or sending an email. We're going to choose a file and we're going to find a file on our desktop. So I created a folder called FY23 Budget Support Docs. So you might see things like this. So if you have it all as one Word attachment, that's fine. Well, it might make it easier for Lynette to access that information once she gets these packaged for budget and finance. But we can find the attachment we want to include. So I've got the 1-3-5-year plan attachment highlighted. I click open. And once I hit upload, that attachment's now there. And I can continue to add attachments if necessary. So here's my budget justification attachment. Upload, page refreshes, and they're both there now and accessible. And if that's all the documentation I need to include, it includes all that stuff that was sent in that email. I click save to make sure all my work in progress is saved. And we're good to go. We know that it's there. You know it's there. It's accessible to anyone now that has access to your program and checkbook. Lynette added in prior years we can only upload one attachment. Yes. Last year it would have to be one attachment. So some of your stuff you might have as an Excel spreadsheet and some it might be a Word document. You can upload those in multiple files if needed. But once you're finished, then you can move on to your next checkbook. Or if you're done, you're done. If you're not the program director, then let the program director know that the budget's been uploaded along with the attachments. If we submitted this, so we locked this worksheet, we can't even access to add more attachments if we needed to. So it's why I stress using just the save, the blue save worksheet button. Okay. If you want to make sure that your budget's visible to others, next to planner, you'll have an option that says summary. And because I'm already in FY23, it's going to start with that. And so it's going to give me as a default view checkbook summary. So I can see the proposals currently by checkbook here. And we can choose this to be by account, by funding source, however we wanted to view that. So if I used funding source, and then the one we were just working on, say, and I load, once this page loads, there's that budget summary by funding source for the one we just worked on. If you needed to expand this information to see other information, there's buttons here: expand, all dimensions, detailed budget analysis. So you have three options to include that. But if we see this at this point, we know finance can see the budget proposal. So you've done a great job. It's saved and ready to go. And if you needed a copy of that, you can hit one of those reports and get your Excel spreadsheet of what the proposal is. So pretty good way of following up to make sure your budget's there. And you can see there's that October. I didn't enter any other months, so those are all blank. And then there's the notes I've added. And we have a question: do we include the ARPA budgets as well if funded for more than 1 year? And this probably goes for any of the stuff that might last multiple years. If your full budget has already been approved and is sitting in intact, you don't need to propose it again. It's already there. All right, that's all the material I'm going to cover. Are there any questions or any more questions we have? Okay. I know time is of the essence for a lot of you since we're only 6 days away from getting our budgets in. So later today, you're going to get an email from me that's going to include the worksheet, the Excel spreadsheet that we use to import. I'll include a link to the slide decks, and the recording for this one today probably won't be available today. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to send a link to the recording from the one I did in April that was basically this presentation. So you can have immediate access to one of those if you needed to use the video for reference. But when today's video becomes available, which is more than likely tomorrow, I'll get the email from WebEx saying it's ready to go. I'll make sure and send this link out also. All right, so I didn't see any other questions coming in. So everybody, thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of the day.